Welcome back, everybody. Part 4. I've now covered parts 1, 2, 3, and now we're on the final part here. This one's going to be dealing with more in the future. We've talked about what America's doing in part 3, and so now we're going to be looking at, I guess, sort of the Cold War-ish era. At least this would be in our timeline. And to see if we're going to have a Cold War between Nazi Germany and the United States, and sort of what this looks like. If you haven't checked out the other parts, like I said, go check those out. I'll put a link in the description. And here's a card thing. And there you go, in the top right. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe. We recently hit 300 subscribers. Super happy about that. 30% of the way there to 1,000. And yeah, let's see if we can hit 1,000 by the end of the summer. We shall find out. So let's see. What if Germany won World War II, Part 4. Oh, this is cool. Okay. This is cool. The dominant force in mainland
When we saw
Europe.
what happened across the Atlantic, we were in shock. Europe went from our greatest ally to foe in just a few years, entirely transformed under the veil of fascism. Of course, we thought we were next. Sympathizers were everywhere.
Oh, okay, that was really cool. What a cool intro. I hadn't done that in those other parts, so this is... That's really neat. I like that. That was very cinematic.
This is the fourth and final part to my series, What If Germany Won World War II? Due to simple delays, glitches, and issues with YouTube, I didn't feel confident releasing such a video until now. If you haven't seen the previous 3 parts, click here or in the description below to get caught up. In this alternate world, Germany has defeated the Allies, and has not only gone on to secure the land it conquered, but has redefined Europe in its image.
Interesting. So if we have a look at the map here, actually, is this... In 1973. Interesting. Okay, so Ostland, Ukraine has been divided up into Reichskommissariat, Moscow, Finland's on its own, Norwegen. So Sweden is still a neutral nation then in 1973. Interesting. So Sweden has maintained its neutrality somehow. Fascinating. So I guess this actually sort of answers the questions that I had around Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. So it looks like Hungary has kept on to its territory. Romania now controls Bessarabia. Bulgaria, I'm not quite sure what this region is, but it looks like that's what it controls. So Croatia, as we talked about in part 3, now controls most of the Balkans, with, I believe this is Slovenia here, being in German and Italian control. Montenegro belongs to the, so zu Italienen, belongs to the Italians, and Albania has taken land north there. So the Hellenic Republic, the Hellenische Republik, is here in the south. Cool. And then this is all... So Turkey still stands. Interesting. So Der Türkei still stands, but it looks like It looks like Libya is Italian, Egypt is German, and Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, they are all belonging to Germany. Wow. So, okay, so this is complete domination. It looks like the only countries that still stand that are not a puppet state of Nazi Germany are, or direct partners are Turkey, Sweden, and Spain. So I guess Spain stays neutral in this matter. What's going on with Portugal, though? Interesting. Okay, so I think we've had a good look at this map here. So I hope it gets into some of these partners, right? Turkey, Spain, Portugal, but let's find out.
Becoming the most dominant force in...
I find it interesting that Spain wouldn't take the opportunity to maybe invade Portugal given all this chaos, but I'm not too familiar with Spanish politics during this time, so...
the Western world. Hitler's armies conquered Britain and Russia, then implemented a genocide far larger than that of the Holocaust in our timeline. Unter mentioned the Nazi eyes such as gypsies, homosexuals, communists, disabled, and Jews have long been wiped off the map in Europe. Millions of ethnic Russians have perished from hunger policies, the Russian culture and nation destroyed, similar to the Native Americans, as German colonists migrate into these new lands. Military victories and a theoretical economic boom have solidified Nazism and other forms of fascism as a legitimate form of government. In Germany, the very existence of the nation revolves entirely around the Aryan race and defeating perceived enemies of it. Other fascist states have begun shaping their citizens to fear an enemy of their people as well. And the last three...
So there was a comment that was brought up in part 2 about how, or maybe it was part 1, about how overreaching this commentator, sorry, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, thinks that Slav resistance would have. And I think he makes a really good point. It made me sort of overthink how overreaching the state could be in this timeline. Although I do think that this ethnic, cleansing would have taken place. I think it would have been with also a very strong amount of resistance from the Slavs, and that they wouldn't sort of just be, casually wiped out in a manner. So that commentator really made me rethink sort of the position on it. And I think that the Nazis would have actually a harder time maintaining their control in Europe in the post-war years. And maybe by 1973, probably all resistance has been eliminated. But who knows what could have happened in that time period through these resistance. And I also talked about the Catholics, right? So I think there'd be more resistance than this video series has brought up. But yeah, so we'll see what it looks like in now the 70s.
Parts I covered how Germany shaped this alternate Europe, how it transformed the culture, and how it began to interact with other regions of the globe like the United States. Part 3 had split the timeline into 2 alternate scenarios, one where Germany and America went to war, and another where they did not. One ended in nuclear annihilation, at least by my prediction. This is the second one. Keep in mind when I discuss this alternate scenario, I'm not saying this is what absolutely would have happened. This is simply my prediction, using facts and evidence from our timeline. Yet as we get farther from the events of World War II, say into the 50s and 60s, I'll be building off of the scenario I previously built in the last parts, instead of purely what happened in our timeline. We never truly know what would have happened or if the Nazi Reich would have survived. This is just one scenario. I'm going to cover this alternate timeline, where Nazi Germany and the United States coexist without full-scale war. This is going to focus on the large-scale effects of a Nazi victory. If Hitler's best-case scenario went into effect, what would that mean for other continents? First, let's continue back inside of the United States. In this alternate Nazi victory, the political dynamic is quite similar to the novel Fatherland. The United States and Nazi Germany are 2 powers separated by an ocean. The governments of these 2 countries despise each other, and neither side is looking to make friends. Not only that, but the United States is still aiding the British Crown in its own struggle against the Nazis. Remember back to when Nazi Germany conquered Britain? The British royal family fled to Canada, where the UK government in exile remains.
So this is one big question I have. I want to know the influence they
Just
have.
across America's northern border, whatever is left of the UK government is still alive. The Americans and United Kingdom have been left in a tricky situation, as the Nazis have conquered the homeland of a vast worldwide empire. The colonies of the old British Empire now have 3 choices.
Let's go back there for a second. Okay, so this answered my question of what's going on with the British Empire. Oh, are we to really assume that they'd be able to conquer everything? Wow. Okay. So they own all of Africa for all intents and purposes. And he hasn't talked about what would be happening with the Free French government, but let's assume that this is all owned by Vichy France. So all of Africa is controlled by the Axis powers. India, though, I mean, okay. I just wonder sort of how would that be possible? I get that that's not the point, and I don't want to just stick on how would that be possible, but I don't know. It seems a little even far-fetched to me to sort of say that everything has fallen and Britain is literally reduced down to Canada. But okay, all right. So now that we know that, let's move forward.
Vast
Malaysia too.
Worldwide empire. The colonies of the old British Empire now have 3 choices. 1. Recognize the new British puppet government as their leaders. 2. Remain loyal to the exiled British crown. Or 3. Use the opportunity to fight for independence while the British system is in turmoil.
Yep.
So, with the Nazis conquering Britain, a powder keg of political instability held down by British guns explodes across the globe. In India, the already settled independence movement would use the advantage to declare themselves separate from their old British colonial masters. In our timeline, when India did declare independence, there was fear of immediate civil war as the two dominant religious factions, Hindus and Muslims, disagreed on how to divide the new country, if at all. Hindus wished for a united India, while Muslim leaders feared Hindu domination and wanted an independent Islamic state. To prevent war and to appease the Islamic leaders who wished for a Muslim country, the British in our timeline divided the two and left the two groups to settle it for themselves. The following migrations were a disaster, however they prevented civil war. In this
Yeah, and and this isn't a part of history that I'm terribly well informed at, but it is argued that it might have constituted a genocide. Like I said, not too familiar about this side of the world's history, so I don't want to comment too much on it. But there's some really, really fascinating events that took place up to in India's independence in I want to say 54, but I might be wrong on that.
Alternate timeline, with British authority now defunct, the Indians are left to deal with the situation on their own terms. The situation easily spirals out of control, and sectarian violence erupts between Hindus and Muslims over different regions. This happens across much of sub-Saharan
Sorry, so when I said this was all controlled, I went too far ahead. Apologies on that.
Africa as well, simply from the British government no longer being there like a chicken with its head cut off. Since there are so many factors, I'm not going to predict the specific results of each colony's fate. However, in countries with a large Anglo population, the colony will remain loyal to the British crown, such as the Falklands or even in already independent nations like Australia, New Zealand, and with apartheid South Africa.
So I guess that New Zealand survived the Emu genocide.
The UK government would attempt to maintain the fragment of its falling empire, colonies either being swept up under Nazi control, as in Egypt, becoming independent throughout Africa, or coming to Allied support in Australia and New Zealand. The war wouldn't end for the British once the Nazis took Britain. It would simply be extended to skirmishes. The United States in this alternate timeline helps the British maintain any control, but now must deal with the diplomatic relationship with the Nazi government. In a very realistic scenario, Hitler would have declared war on America just as he did in our timeline. Yet if he didn't, the debate between what America's relationship should be with Nazi Germany would be a critical moment in US history. American politics inside the United States would be shaped on foreign policy matters with Adolf Hitler. If the German Reich was to be permanent, then being enemies forever wouldn't be in the Americans' best interest. Europe was still a market after all, and this monetary value would influence American politicians.
And sadly, what it comes down to, and this is what it comes down to a lot of the time, is that it's just about money. And I agree with what he said, that American companies would probably begin to start looking the other way, even with this influence of the British family, right, and the people living in the United States. I think he makes a fascinating point of saying that the social policies would move more towards seeing Nazism as a viable model, and it would set back civil rights. But my main point is, at the end of the day, it always comes down to money. Always, always, always.
Camps would probably develop, move to have diplomatic ties with Germany, or to remain staunch enemies with Nazi Germany. In our timeline, influential people already pressed for diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany, but usually this was because they held Nazi beliefs themselves. Ideas of race and eugenics certainly spanned national borders between Americans and Germans. Not only would Nazi-inspired Americans push for diplomacy and more Nazi influence, but so would politicians afraid of full-scale war, basically just like appeasement in our timeline. While the other side, such as Roosevelt, would remain enemies with the Nazi Reich, not giving in to any demands the Germans make, and continue to support the British in maintaining their crumbling dominion.
So even within this, I mean, there's some fascinating ideas of that. If this is the post-war, right? Does this assume that Roosevelt also got 3 terms, right? Was Dewey elected maybe in 1948, I want to say, right? Where he famously was initially declared the winner. I can't remember the magazine, maybe it was the New York Times. And then Truman holds up the magazine and says Dewey's president of the United States or something like this, right? So I guess we can only assume that the presidents would remain the same, that it would be 3 years of FDR, sorry, not 3 years, 3 terms of FDR, and then he would die halfway through his or part into his third term. Then it'd be Harry Truman and everything like that. But you got to wonder what those individuals and their cabinets, what sort of effect they would have on it, and if the Republicans had controlled it, right, how they might have changed it. Interesting.
Plans the Germans make, and continue to support the British in maintaining their crumbling dominion. I can't predict who would come to define American politics, as this is already so far from our own timeline. Yet I predict a situation like this is entirely possible if no war occurred. What would happen to the rest of the world, especially those people that were not European, or even people directly close to the Nazi Reich? What would Nazi Germany's relationship be with the Islamic world? Nazi foreign policy was entirely determined by what Adolf Hitler believed in. As I mentioned in part 1, the Nazis had a racial hierarchy of people they considered inferior. It's a common misconception that the Nazis would have been best friends with the Islamic world had they won the war.
And there was actually some Islamic divisions that fought for, to say fought for Hitler is maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but fought on the Axis side during the war. And yeah, there's some really, really fascinating brigades that existed during this time. I want to say it was in Iran. And so there is some history of Islamic soldiers fighting for the Axis in World War II.
This alternate timeline, Nazi Germany would not, in any sense, become friends with the Muslim world or with Arabs. Hitler's foreign policy was always a war between Aryans and non-Aryans. Arabs, while not Jewish, were still Semitic, and thus inferior to Europeans in the eyes of the Nazis. However, the plight of the Arabs under British and French occupation did come to the advantage of Germany. In our timeline, Nazi Germany's relationship with the Islamic world was one of convenience. The Arabs and Muslims were subjects since the fall of the Ottomans. Revolts were common and they were not welcome. The Nazis and Muslim world, to sum it up, simply had common enemies. As we know, the Nazis were masters of propaganda and purposely changed information to suit their needs. When Hitler met the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Nazis popularized the meeting in an attempt to win over Arab support and destabilize the Allies. However, this doesn't mean the Nazis entirely hated the Muslim world. Hitler personally held kind views for Islam, seeing it as a better alternative for Europeans than Christianity, which he
Really? That's fascinating. Okay.
saw as too soft, even going so far to say he wished that Islam had spread into Europe at the Battle of Tours. The Nazi view on the world changed by who they were currently fighting. That was it. It happened against the British, it happened against the Nords, it would happen against the Arabs and colonized people as well.
True.
If a group became a burden on the Nazis, they would turn on them, and it's very unlikely the Nazis would keep friendly relationships with them while they sit on the largest oil reserves in the world. If the Nazis had won World War II and the Reich had survived, the Middle East is an obvious target in this alternate 20th century. A war for oil would occur in the Middle East between the Nazis and Muslims, yet there would be no insurgency, as bombings and massacre would be used to quell any rebellion. The Nazi state...
Again, just going off that comment too in part 2, I don't know if it would be that easy. However, let's keep going with it.
Was not to trade with people it saw as inferior, and even then it was to be as inclusive as possible with its goods. If the society was successful and German population explodes, then more people require more land to sustain it. Even in today's Western society, consumerism requires mass amounts of food, labor, and shipping to sustain such a population. While Nazi Germany may not have had the consumption rates of Americans, if the society boomed in population as well, Germany would need to keep expanding or collapse. I can spend the video saying if Nazis declare war on these people or not throughout the remainder of the alternate 20th century, but it's all the same equal possibility. Politics of the world could be drastically different in this alternate 1960 than in 1980, even if Nazi Germany successfully took Europe. Predicting the specifics of war, economics, and politics decades after our timeline split is an inaccurate endeavor. When some theorize about Nazi Germany winning World War II, they imagine the Nazis dominating the globe and surviving forever.
Yeah, and there's always that's something that's always exploited by sort of Wolfenstein, that sort of sci-fi Nazi stuff, where they end up on the moon and they colonize Mars and all these things. I don't really know where that comes from, actually. There's always sort of Nazis in space, Nazis on the moon, Nazis with nukes, Nazi time traveling. There's always sort of these crazy things that come out of the science fiction world. I don't know. Maybe you guys know where that comes from. And if you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much for sticking along this far. I hope you're enjoying it.
This is entirely possible. It could have happened had the situation been right, who knows. But as we see time and time again in human history, empires and countries fall. Even if they do not collapse, they change ideas.
So that's funny. Yeah, so with 1910, USA being please leave me alone, and then 1970s with aviators where the commies at. The switch in U.S. policy, from what I understand, a lot of it sort of started with Woodrow Wilson and Wilsonianism, with him with the 14 points after World War I, and him wanting to really expand more and become sort of more of an imperialist USA. However, there was also some imperial ambitions with Cuba, right, with the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. And so it's actually really quite fascinating to see sort of the change in foreign policy between 1910 and 1970. And I think that really did start in sort of the 1890s, 1910s. Might be mildly wrong on that. I'm not a big U.S. historian kind of guy. I'm more into Canadian history. But I think this is quite a clever joke.
Ideologies, politics, and societies evolve from generation to the next. Even if Nazi Germany won the war, this doesn't mean the Reich that Hitler oversaw would survive forever. The 1940s German Reich that we think of certainly couldn't survive forever. So what is the biggest effect of a Nazi victory in this alternate timeline? Ideology. Ideology shapes mankind, shapes our beliefs, our morals, to an extent, how we see ourselves as people on this earth, the gods we worshipped, the politics we think, not in the current time, but those few ideas are able to stick, and through the butterfly effect define what
the pen is mightier than the sword, gentlemen.
We think it means to be human. The writings of Marx affected millions of people across the globe, either by force or by inspiration. Each idea is stuck at a crossroads whether it should survive or not. Fascism is no different, forever legitimizing this political experiment in this alternate world, at least to the inhabitants.
Right, and he makes a good point. I mean, even, communism, right, has certainly stuck around in its certain characteristics, even though the attempt at it through the Soviet Union was obviously a failure. And again, I know it's much more complicated than that. There's varying political philosophies. It's not just, Marx invented communism. That is the one way of doing it. I understand that. Don't get me wrong. But even then, you still have the sticking points with places like China, Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam as well, that have sort of adapted and changed these ideologies throughout history. So if we can use this comparison of Marx's writings, right, in sort of socialism, communism, whatever it is you want to call it, and I understand that this is a very complicated topic and it's not black and white that, this is communist, this is not communist. I understand that. But if you're to use it as sort of a template and to say if fascism existed in this period, even if it did eventually fall, some of these fascist ideas, which people might have deemed, worthy of keeping, given that the fact that Germany had survived in this timeline, maybe that could be something that would be looked at today, right? Maybe, I don't know, just pick a random country, maybe would be leaning more fascist, and sort of take some of the principles of fascism that it wants to keep, albeit. Yeah, that's still a scary world where any sort of tenets of fascism are still allowed to exist, or not even allowed to, but are still existing in a country today.
When the Nazis lost World War II in our timeline, the most important part was the death of the ideology. The Nuremberg trials gave evidence to the atrocities Nazism spawned. Hitler's war brought death and destruction to Germany. No mass resistance ever occurred to defend Hitler's legacy. In this alternate timeline, this never happens.
So the biggest to defend Hitler's legacy was some of the political groups that popped up in West Germany, a lot of them being former Wehrmacht officers and some former SS men as well. The one thing that I think is interesting, and I don't want to get too far into it, but there was groups that sort of wanted to guarantee Wehrmacht pensions, and sort of not reprisals, I want to say, but social support for previous serving members of the Wehrmacht. And I think that's sort of interesting. And it's something I want to read more about. It, admittedly, I've just sort of skimmed the surface of it, but I'd like to find some more books and papers on that, because I think it's an interesting idea. The fact of that you have a failed state with a failed ideology that the world has completely annihilated, right? What do you do about the individuals that served in this army, and some of them for not even political purposes, but rather because they had to?
The Nazis managed to maintain a successful nation until Hitler's death. The ideology he spurred would be immortalized. The best comparison is with the Founding Fathers in the United States. American politics is diverse, but no matter what, there is never a politician or mainstream figure that disagrees with the ideas of the founders
okay.
and the Constitution. This is because
I'm not sure about that one, but okay.
the ideology has become a part of the culture of the United States. As a founder...
Yeah, but not every amendment, right? Like, you know, the third amendment, the 26th amendment, I think. Or sorry, not the third amendment, the 13th amendment, the 26th amendment. Okay.
Died, they became more than men, but idols to look back on and
But
emulate.
true, yeah,
The
I
politics
understand
of
his
each
point.
party is its own way of interpreting the words of the Constitution.
Sure,
Not to compare the founders to the Nazis, but the same logic would still apply. If all went well for Nazi Germany, decades after Adolf Hitler's death, even if the Third Reich collapsed, there could be major differences between fascist and Nazi
True.
parties.
Yep.
He would remain
True.
an idol to these alternate people throughout the world. As generations are born and can't remember a time before the Nazis, the ideology is normalized in the eyes of the people. Now,
True, right, and that's how, like, some, you know, every once in a while you do see protests with sort of Stalinist banners, Maoists, right, and other sort of people like this that, yeah, I mean, I can totally see that happening in this alternative timeline if it's based purely on the ideological standpoint. So, fascinating point that he brings up. Love this guy's videos. They're so well thought out. Really, really like them.
this isn't to say the world would be Nazi, yet this would show that Nazism would play a much larger role in mankind's
Yeah,
future than in
definitely.
our timeline.
Yep.
Marx's ideas are emulated and debated today among communists. In this alternate timeline, as more people are born into this Nazi-influenced world, their own ideas on fascism might be shaped by the times they live in. A dark, alternate spectrum of political thought based around fascism.
True,
As the centuries
definitely.
would move on,
Yep.
people would look back on the war in ways we don't even know now. In our timeline, centuries from now, World War II will remain a defining moment in mankind's history. This
Absolutely.
single conflict shaped the economic, cultural, and political change that shaped our modern world. It will only grow more influential in the centuries to come, as the actions we make today influence the decisions of our descendants. World War II could have been the end to entire cultures. It already devastated so much of the globe, but it very well could have been far worse, becoming a new chapter in human history, one not led by Nazis, but one led by people inspired by Hitler and have an influential say in the globe. This is simply one scenario out of the endless possibilities. There is never any true way to know how the world would have been had Germany won World War II, but it's always interesting to theorize. Thanks for watching 4 parts of this scenario, and thanks
Cool.
for supporting me through the times of trying to get this out. This is Cody of the Alternate History Hub.
Fantastic. Yeah, just great videos. Love this guy's videos. Cool. I think he summed it up there really, really well in the end. Just, you know, thankfully we don't have to experience this timeline. Thankfully we live in, you know, in our own timeline. Not that we have a choice of it. But yeah, hoped you guys enjoyed this 4-part series. Let me know if you would want me to do something like this again, where we take a long video series and we go into all the different parts, or if you guys sort of prefer the more one-off videos on certain topics. So yeah, without further ado, thank you all very much for joining me for 4 parts. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.